What if the secrets to divine power were never supernatural at all, just a science we forgot how to read? What if the world's most feared texts were actually misunderstood wisdom? What if we've been reading ancient grimoires all wrong? There are books that have survived fire, persecution, and centuries of deliberate silence. Not because they contain dark spells, not because they are evil, but because something inside them keeps resonating with human beings across generations, across cultures, across belief systems. And one of the most controversial among them has been sitting in plain sight the entire time, dismissed, mislabeled, and feared: the 6th and 7th books of Moses. Most people hear that name and immediately assume the worst. But this isn't the strangest part. For centuries, these texts were lumped together with forbidden occult literature, treated as dangerous relics of a darker spiritual era. Churches condemned them, scholars ignored them, entire communities built walls around their content, not because the information was inherently harmful, but because it was deeply uncomfortable. It forced a question that religious institutions rarely welcome. What if divine power was never meant to be exclusive? What if access to the sacred was never supposed to require a gatekeeper? That question alone explains why these books were silenced. And this is where everything shifts. When you strip away the ritualistic language, when you move past the dramatic imagery of seals and incantations, something unexpected appears inside these pages. Structure, intentionality, a sophisticated system for altering human consciousness through focused attention, symbolic concentration, and deliberate mental discipline. Not superstition, not dark magic, a methodology, one that echoes, almost word for word, what modern neuroscientists and psychologists are now discovering about the brain's capacity to access extraordinary states of awareness. This wasn't coincidence. This was knowledge. And this opens a door few dare to cross. The real question isn't whether these books are sacred or dangerous. The real question is why it took humanity this long to stop being afraid of them long enough to actually read them. Because hidden inside what the world called forbidden, there may be one of the most complete and honest descriptions of spiritual self-mastery ever written. And it has been waiting quietly for the right moment to be understood. That moment may be right now. If this kind of hidden spiritual knowledge speaks to you, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. How did ancient mystics access states modern science can only begin to explain? How the brain becomes a gateway to the divine. It starts with something that will reframe everything you thought you knew about spiritual experience. For most of human history, mystical states were treated as miracles, gifts from above, moments that happened to certain people under certain conditions that no one could fully explain. But in the last several decades, neuroscience has started mapping exactly what happens inside the human brain during deep spiritual experience, and the findings are not what most people expected. The brain doesn't receive the divine from the outside. It generates the conditions for it from within. There's one detail almost no one notices. When researchers studied advanced meditators, monks, and individuals in states of deep contemplative prayer, they found consistent patterns. Specific brainwave frequencies were activated. Theta waves, sitting at the threshold between waking and sleep, became dominant. Gamma bursts associated with peak awareness and insight appeared in regions of the brain normally quiet during everyday consciousness. These weren't random. They were reproducible, trainable, and they aligned, almost perfectly, with the internal states that ancient spiritual practices were specifically designed to induce. The 6th book of Moses describes concentration techniques that mirror this process precisely. And this is where everything shifts. The incantations, the symbols, the rhythmic repetitions documented in these ancient grimoires weren't arbitrary rituals. They were induction tools, technologies for shifting brainwave states in a pre-scientific era that had no vocabulary for neurology but understood, through centuries of experimentation, what worked, what produced genuine interior transformation, what created access to heightened intuition, expanded awareness, and what practitioners across every tradition have described as contact with something larger than the individual self. Hinduism called it samadhi. Christian mystics called it contemplative union. Sufi masters called it fana. Modern neuroscience calls it a gamma-dominant altered state. What comes next is deeply unsettling. They are all describing the same event, from different languages, different continents, different centuries. And the texts we labeled as forbidden were doing exactly this, offering a structured pathway into that state, available to anyone willing to practice the discipline. This isn't fringe theory. This is convergent evidence across traditions and now increasingly, across scientific disciplines. Drop a comment below if you've ever felt something shift during prayer, meditation, or a moment of deep stillness. You may understand this better than you think. Why do sacred symbols still trigger something deep inside the human mind? Why? Ancient symbols were never just decoration. There's a moment many people experience, usually without being able to explain it, when they encounter a sacred symbol and feel something stir inside them. Not an intellectual reaction, something more visceral, an internal recognition that bypasses language entirely. That experience is not mystical coincidence. It is a measurable neurological response to a specific category of visual information that the human mind has been trained, across thousands of years of cultural repetition, to respond to in a particular way. Symbols are not decoration. They are activation codes. But there's one detail almost no one notices. Within the 6th and 7th books of Moses, the seals and diagrams that fill the pages were understood by their users as concentration anchors, objects of focused attention that narrowed mental activity, reduced scattered thought, and created the conditions for heightened inner awareness. This is exactly what modern psychology identifies as attentional narrowing and flow state induction. When a person holds sustained, non-analytical attention on a single symbolic object, something measurable happens inside the prefrontal cortex. The noise quiets, clarity increases, access to deeper layers of cognition opens. The ancients didn't have brain scans, but they had results. And this is where everything shifts. Across world religions, this principle appears in remarkably consistent forms. The intricate geometry of Islamic architecture is not simply beautiful. It was designed to guide the mind into a contemplative state. The elaborate mandalas of Tibetan Buddhism are not art for art's sake. They are structured meditation supports. The sacred diagrams of Kabbalistic tradition map inner dimensions of consciousness with the precision that continues to inform modern psychology. And the symbols inside the books of Moses belong in that same lineage. A visual language designed to move the practitioner inward. What comes next is deeply unsettling. If these symbols still trigger a response in people today, centuries after their original context was lost, that tells us something important. It tells us that the human brain retains something like a spiritual muscle memory, a capacity for sacred recognition that doesn't disappear just because the cultural framework around it changes. The forbidden books weren't destroyed, they survived. And perhaps the reason they survived is the same reason the response they were designed to create never fully went away. If this content is opening something new for you, a like. It helps this channel reach the people who need to hear this. What if spiritual protection was always a function of the mind, not the mystical? What ancient protection rituals were actually teaching us? When people hear the phrase spiritual protection, the images that come to mind tend to be dramatic. Circles drawn on floors, words spoken in ancient languages, objects placed at doorways to ward off evil. And while those images carry real cultural weight, they have also obscured something much more practical and much more powerful, sitting just beneath the surface of those traditions. Spiritual protection in every tradition that has ever taught it seriously begins with the interior. But this isn't the strangest part. The practices described in the books of Moses, when read carefully and without fear, reveal a consistent psychological principle. The state of mind you inhabit determines the quality of reality you experience. This is not mysticism. This is cognitive science. When the mind is scattered, fearful, and reactive, it amplifies every threat. When the mind is calm, anchored, and intentionally directed, it processes difficulty without being consumed by it. Ancient practitioners understood this and built entire systems of training around it. What they called protection rituals were, functionally, practices for cultivating an inner state that was difficult to destabilize. The outer form was symbolic. The inner result was real. And this is where everything shifts. This principle appears without exception across the world's contemplative traditions. The Ignatian spiritual exercises in Christianity are designed to create interior stability through structured mental practice. Buddhist Vipassana teaches observation without reactivity, a form of inner fortification. Islamic dhikr, the rhythmic repetition of divine names, creates focused consciousness states that anchor the practitioner against emotional volatility. These are not superstitions. They are sophisticated interior technologies. And the books of Moses were teaching the same principle using the symbolic language of their time and place. What comes next is deeply unsettling. In 2026, the threats to inner stability are not supernatural. They are algorithmic, social, psychological. But the solution the ancient texts point toward is remarkably applicable. Conscious intention, disciplined attention, the daily practice of anchoring the mind in a chosen state, rather than allowing it to be pulled by every external current. This is what the forbidden books were actually offering. Not power over others, power over the self. And that remains the rarest and most valuable kind of protection available to any human being alive today. Why the legacy of the sixth book speaks more clearly to this generation than any before it. The sixth book was always meant to be found now. In an era of instant information, artificial intelligence, and access to virtually every text ever written, why does a collection of grimoires from the 18th century still carry enough power to move people? Why do these books still circulate, still get passed from hand to hand, still generate the same mixture of reverence and fear they always have? Because the human hunger they speak to has never changed. There's one detail almost no one notices. Every generation believes it is the first to truly grapple with questions of meaning, protection, consciousness, and connection to the divine. And every generation discovers eventually that those questions were asked long before, in different languages, in different cultural containers, but with the same urgency and the same depth. The sixth and seventh books of Moses are not relics of a more primitive time. They are evidence of a continuous human project, the attempt to document and transmit techniques for accessing the deepest layers of conscious experience. That project never ended. We just stopped reading certain chapters. And this is where everything shifts. When you place these texts alongside the mystical literature of Hinduism, the meditative manuals of Buddhism, the esoteric traditions within Judaism and Islam, and the contemplative writings of Christian mystics, a coherent pattern emerges. Different vocabularies describing the same interior landscape, different cultural frameworks pointing toward the same fundamental human capacity, the ability to deliberately shift the state of your own consciousness, to access clarity, intuition, and a sense of connection that transcends ordinary experience. That capacity belongs to every person alive. What comes next is deeply unsettling. The books we called forbidden weren't threatening because they contained darkness. They were threatening because they contained a form of empowerment that required no institution, no intermediary, no hierarchy of access, just practice, just intention, just the willingness to go inward and take that journey seriously. And that, across centuries and cultures, has always been the most radical idea of all. If this opens something inside you, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every video here is a step deeper. And tell us in the comments, which part of this conversation stayed with you the most? Because some truths don't arrive through argument. They arrive through recognition.